What's going on, everybody? Kalibus Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, we're going to take another look at the BLU Bold N2 about 6 months after my original review and go over whether or not it's still a good phone to buy at this point. Now, as always, if you do end up wanting to learn more about this phone, definitely check out the description where I am linking to several other videos about it, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But with that being said, let's get into it. So with the BLU Bold N2, probably one of my favorite things about this phone is the display we're getting here. With this phone, we're getting a 6.6-inch AMOLED display. Keep in mind it does have a 120Hz refresh rate, so despite actually having to go into the settings and activate this manually, once you do, the movement on the screen is going to be a little bit faster and smoother, making the phone feel a bit more premium. We're also getting a 1080p resolution here, so a real nice, sharp, crisp image. We're getting a PPI of 390 and a 19.5:9 aspect ratio. And as you can see, the bezels are really thin, so the phone looks nice and modern and in general pretty premium. So overall, I really have no complaints about this display. Keep in mind, at full price factory unlocked, this phone is going for around $249. And considering this, getting an AMOLED display is really impressive. Compared to something like an IPS LCD, for example, the display is a bit brighter, the colors are a bit nicer, and the viewing angles are a bit better too. So if you're outside in the sun, for example, or really in any kind of bright area, this phone is still going to be pretty easy to see. So in general, if you're looking for a more affordable phone that has a really nice display, the BLU Bold N2 will be a great choice. Now for storage, the BLU Bold N2 is getting 256GB of internal storage, but unfortunately we're not getting microSD card expansion here. Now I kind of have mixed feelings about this because on one hand, microSD card expansion is something that you really just kind of expect in a phone like this, but on the other hand, I mean, 256GB is quite a bit of storage, and for most people, this is probably going to be way more than you actually need. So in general, really the main drawback here is if your current phone already has microSD card expansion and you maybe have a bunch of information on that, having to deal with transferring stuff from a microSD card onto a phone that can't even use a microSD card can be pretty annoying. But aside from that, I feel like with the internal storage we're getting here, even without microSD card expansion, most people probably won't have any issues. Now for security features, with the BLU Bold N2, this phone does have Face Unlock and a really nice in-display fingerprint scanner too. So let's give it a try. There we go. One more time. And there we go. So nice looking animation, and the fingerprint scanner is real fast and responsive, so definitely great there. And I am glad that we are getting Face Unlock too, so if you want to use that instead, you always can. Now for the camera setup here, up front we get a 16-megapixel selfie camera, then on the back we get a quad camera setup with a 64-megapixel main camera, a 5-megapixel ultra-wide camera, a 2-megapixel macro camera, and a 2-megapixel depth sensing camera. And then for video, this phone can record 2K videos in the rear camera and 1080p in the front. So no 4K, but honestly, in this price range, you're really not going to find very many phones, if any for that matter, that can actually record 4K videos anyway. So not really that surprising, but in general, when it comes to the overall camera features, I really don't have any complaints. We got pretty much every camera feature you can typically expect in a mid-range phone, including an ultra-wide camera and a macro camera. So if you're really using your camera a lot and you want a wider variety of features, you definitely won't be disappointed here. And in addition to this, the photo quality is pretty good too. To give you an idea of what it can do, here's some pictures taken with the BLU Bold N2. So yeah, again, I do think the photo quality for what it is pretty good. Sure, when you compare it to something like a Samsung Galaxy S21 FE or a Google Pixel 6a, of course the quality is not going to be nearly as good, but for a really affordable phone you can get for less than $300, I am pretty impressed with the photo quality. For typical casual daily use, maybe you're taking a few Instagram photos here and there, sending photos to friends and family, or maybe taking vacation photos for your own memories. For that kind of stuff, you really don't need a super high-end expensive device. You can simply get something more affordable like this, and honestly, for most people, will get the job done just fine. So overall, if you're looking for an affordable phone that has a decently nice camera, then I do think the BLU Bold N2 will be a great choice. And again, when it comes to video quality, remember this phone can at least record 2K videos in the rear camera, and while 2K is still not 4K, it is still at least something. So if you want to record in a slightly nicer resolution, but you don't necessarily care about 4K, then this is going to be a nice feature to have. Now for the RAM and processor, with the BLU Bold N2, this phone has 8GB of RAM, which is definitely impressive, and we're also getting the MediaTek Dimensity 810 processor. Now in general, when it comes to performance, on one hand, definitely don't expect like flagship level performance. If you're really on your phone all the time doing more demanding activities, you will notice this is definitely not the fastest phone you can get, but at the same time, for typical daily use for stuff like web browsing, social media, using the phone as a phone of course, and then doing stuff like watching videos and playing games, for that sort of activity, compared to other phones in this general price range, I do think the performance here, while not necessarily being better than other phones like this, is still definitely good. And also keep in mind, just in case you didn't know, the Blue Bolt N2, despite not having 5G in the name, is still a 5G phone, so if you're hoping to get 5G connectivity, you won't have to worry about that here. Now I did run a benchmark test on this phone using Geekbench 6, and here are the results I got. So what I recommend doing is running this test on your current phone, and then comparing your results to these, and that's going to give you a better idea of where this phone stands performance-wise compared to your current device. Because depending on what you currently have, this phone may or may not be an actual performance upgrade. But overall, again in my experience, the performance is definitely decent, probably near upper mid-range level, which considering again this phone is under $300, I would say it is pretty impressive. Now for the battery, with the Blue Bolt N2, we're getting a 4200 mAh battery that supports 30-watt fast charging. So on one hand, it's definitely not terrible. I mean, compared to like your typical iPhone, for example, the battery life here is probably going to be a bit better. But at the same time, if you're comparing it to pretty much any other mid-range phone like this, you might be a little disappointed because at this point in 2023, typically an affordable 5G phone like this is going to have a 5000 mAh battery instead. So in general, if the battery is really a priority for you, then you can definitely do better. But at the same time, in my experience, the battery life on this phone is really not terrible, and the 30-watt fast charging is definitely good too. So if you're in a situation where maybe you're typically around a charger for at least some time during the day, you should be perfectly fine. But if you're maybe traveling a lot, or in any kind of situation where you're maybe not around a charger, and you really want to make sure you have the best battery life you can get, then in that case, you're probably going to want to get something else. Now for the software, I feel like this is really the worst thing about this phone. But with the Blue Bolt N2, unfortunately, we're only getting Android 11, which at this point in 2023, seeing as we're halfway through the year, it's definitely pretty outdated. And seeing as Blue really doesn't have very good software support, I'm not even expecting to get Android 12, let alone Android 13 or 14. So if the software is at all important to you, I would definitely get a different phone. But I know there are some people out there who really just don't care what version of Android you have. So if that's you, then maybe it will be okay. But honestly, I feel like if you're really just going through the trouble of getting a new phone anyway, there's so many other options out there that have comparable features to this phone that have much better software. I mean, there are Samsung phones, for example, that were made like 2-3 years ago that still have Android 13, whereas this phone was released last year at this time maybe. And again, as you can see here, it does only have Android 11, which when this phone came out was still outdated. I mean, in the summer of 2022 we were on Android 12, so this phone has never had the latest version of Android, even when it was brand new. So in general, again, on one hand, if you maybe don't really care about the software, then this might not matter, but I feel like for most people, being stuck on Android 11 is definitely a drawback. Now as far as other features go, unfortunately this phone doesn't have NFC, so if you like to use tap and pay, then you are going to want to get something else. And at this point in 2023, this is really another huge drawback because at least in the US, pretty much every store you're going to go to is going to have some sort of tap and pay. And while not everyone uses it, I feel like it's nice to at least have the option. I know some people might not ever want to use it, but maybe you currently don't use it, but maybe you end up wanting to try it later. Well, if your phone doesn't have NFC, then you don't even have that option. So really, if you could see yourself ever using NFC, then I would definitely avoid this phone. And another thing to keep in mind here is that unfortunately, this phone does not have a headphone jack, which on one hand, as you can see here, it does come with not only a pair of USB-C headphones, but also a 3.5mm adapter, so I can kind of forgive it at this point, but in case you've never used one of these things before, I will tell you from experience, they do break pretty easily, so not having a headphone jack in general is never not going to be a drawback. And of course, with stuff like flagship phones, we've been dealing with that for quite a while, but considering this is more of a lower end device, seeing that it doesn't have such a basic feature is honestly pretty disappointing. Now as far as the overall design goes, I really do like it in pretty much every way. It has a kind of retro look with the little pill-shaped front-facing camera thing. Kind of reminds me of the Samsung Galaxy S10. The back is made of this, I know it's not actual leather, but it has a leathery kind of texture to it, which does feel pretty cool. Really unique for a phone. I also do like the camera module, and in general it has a nice sleek modern design, and with these curved corners here, it kind of helps make the bezels a bit thinner. So in general, if you're looking for a more affordable phone that has a really nice premium and kind of unique design, I do think you will be happy with this phone. But in conclusion, my general thoughts about the Blue Bolt N2, about 6 months after my original review. Now on one hand, don't get me wrong, this is a pretty cool phone with a really unique design. I feel like Blue really tried to position it as more of a premium device, and in some ways they did kind of succeed in this. Again, it does have a really unique design that you're really not going to find in many other phones. It also has stuff like a really nice looking display, a nice camera, plenty of storage, albeit without microSD card expansion, and decent performance too. But at the same time, it does have some pretty big drawbacks that honestly, in my opinion, really just make it not worth it at all. The most forgivable one here is not having a headphone jack. I mean, on one hand, it's kind of disappointing, but there are plenty of other non-flagship phones that have this same issue, and it is at least easy to deal with, so in general, not really that much of an issue. It also, again, doesn't have microSD card expansion, which would be more of a problem if it didn't have 256 gigabytes of storage, because again, I feel like for the average user, this is really more space than you're probably going to need, so unless you really specifically want to use a microSD card for some reason, the storage is really going to be fine. But the real major drawbacks here is that, first of all, again, we're not getting NFC, which granted may or may not matter for everyone, but I feel like at this point in 2023, pretty much every phone should have NFC. It is a pretty basic feature, and with tap and pay becoming so widely used, it's definitely something I know a lot of people are not going to want to miss out on. But really the biggest drawback, and the thing that really makes it feel like this phone is just not worth buying in general, is definitely the software. Now, on one hand, if this phone had Android 12, for example, it would be at least okay. But I mean, Android 11 at this point in 2023 is just so outdated that I feel like since there's so many other options out there, I personally would just avoid this phone because, yeah, it does have some cool features, but if you're going out of your way to get a new phone, getting one that has a software that's this outdated is not something I would really recommend. So in general, do I think it's a bad phone? No, I honestly don't. But at the same time, at this point in 2023, I still personally wouldn't recommend buying it. Now, once again, if you do end up wanting to learn more about this phone, definitely check out the description, where I am linking to several other videos about it, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipis Tech on Twitter and Instagram. And as always, I will see you in the next video.